The desert sun beat down mercilessly on the military base in Iraq as Captain Sarah Martinez adjusted her flight helmet one more time. The year was 2003, and the invasion had just begun. Around her, male pilots prepared their Apache helicopters with practiced efficiency, their conversations peppered with crude jokes and dismissive glances in her direction. "Hey, Martinez, sure you can handle that bird without breaking a nail?" called out Lieutenant Colonel Rick Thompson, a veteran pilot with 20 years of experience and an ego to match. His comment drew snickers from the other pilots gathered around the mission briefing board. Sarah didn't respond. She had learned long ago that words meant nothing in this environment. Only actions counted, and she intended to let her flying do the talking. At 28 years old, she was one of only 3 female Apache pilots in the entire theater of operations, and the pressure to prove herself was constant and suffocating. The path to this moment had been anything but easy. Growing up in a small town in Texas, Sarah had always been fascinated by aircraft. While other girls her age were playing with dolls, she was building model planes and reading aviation magazines. Her father, a mechanic at the local airport, had encouraged her interest, but her mother worried constantly about her daughter's unconventional dreams. "Flying is a man's job, Mija," her mother would say, using the Spanish term of endearment while expressing her concerns. "Why don't you become a teacher or a nurse? Something safe and respectable for a young woman." But Sarah's determination was unshakable. She excelled in school, particularly in mathematics and physics, subjects that would prove crucial in her aviation career. When she announced her intention to join the military and become a pilot, the reaction from her community was mixed at best. Some called her crazy, others questioned her femininity, and a few even suggested she was just trying to find a husband among the male pilots. The military academy had been her first real taste of the challenges ahead. Despite scoring in the top 5% of her class academically, she faced constant scrutiny from instructors who seemed determined to wash her out of the program. Physical training was grueling, made worse by drill sergeants who pushed her harder than her male counterparts, claiming they were preparing her for the real world where enemy bullets wouldn't discriminate based on gender. "Martinez, drop and give me 50. Sergeant Wilson would bark at the slightest provocation. "If you want to play with the big boys, you better prove you can keep up." The training was designed to break weak candidates, and Sarah watched as several of her classmates, both male and female, gave up and transferred to other programs. But every push-up, every mile run, every verbal assault only strengthened her resolve. She would lie in her narrow dormitory bed at night, muscles aching and pride wounded, but her determination burning brighter than ever. Flight training brought new challenges. The Apache helicopter was a complex machine, bristling with weapons systems and requiring split-second decisions in high-stress situations. The cockpit was cramped, the controls sensitive, and the learning curve steep. Sarah threw herself into studying every manual, memorizing every procedure, and practicing emergency scenarios until they became second nature. Her first instructor, Captain James Bradley, was initially skeptical of her abilities. He had never trained a female Apache pilot before and made no secret of his doubts about women in combat roles. "This isn't a game, Martinez," he told her during their first flight together. "The Apache is a weapon of war, not a taxi service. You need killer instincts, not nurturing ones." Sarah bit back her reply and focused on proving him wrong through performance. She demonstrated exceptional spatial awareness, quick reflexes, and an intuitive understanding of the aircraft's capabilities that surprised even herself. Her gunnery scores were consistently high, and her ability to navigate in challenging conditions earned grudging respect from her instructors. But respect from instructors was different from acceptance by peers. When she was assigned to her first operational unit, the 101st Airborne Division, the reception was cold at best. The other pilots had been flying together for months, had developed bonds forged in training and shared experiences, and saw her as an outsider who didn't belong. "Great. Now we have to babysit a girl," she overheard one pilot saying to another in the mess hall, "Hope she doesn't freeze up when the shooting starts." The comment stung, but Sarah had developed thick skin over the years. She focused on learning her unit's procedures, studying the terrain maps of their area of operations, and maintaining her aircraft to the highest standards. She volunteered for additional training exercises and spent extra hours in the simulator, determined to be the best prepared pilot in the unit. Her aircraft commander, Chief Warrant Officer Mike Rodriguez, was a quiet man with over 15 years of flying experience. Unlike some of the others, he judged pilots based on their abilities rather than their gender. During their first flight together, he put Sarah through a series of challenging maneuvers to assess her skills. "Not bad, Martinez," he said after she successfully completed a series of tactical approaches in simulated enemy territory. "But can you do it when people are shooting at you?" That question would be answered sooner than anyone expected. Intelligence reports indicated significant enemy armor movements in their sector, and their unit was tasked with conducting reconnaissance and interdiction missions. The enemy had been using the cover of darkness to move tanks and armored vehicles, attempting to reinforce positions before coalition ground forces could advance. The night before their first combat mission, Sarah lay in her cramped bunk, listening to the distant sound of artillery fire and wondering if she was truly ready for what lay ahead. She thought about her father's words before she deployed. "Mija, you've worked twice as hard as anyone else to get where you are. Trust in your training, trust in your abilities, and come home safe." Her mother had cried at the airport, begging her to reconsider her career choice. "It's not too late to transfer to something safer," she had pleaded. "Why do you have to prove yourself by putting your life in danger?" But Sarah knew this was exactly what she had trained for. Every hour of flight time, every weapons drill, every tactical exercise had been preparation for this moment. She was as ready as any pilot could be, perhaps more ready than most because she had pushed herself harder and longer than anyone else. The mission briefing the next morning was tense. Intelligence indicated a large convoy of enemy armor moving through a valley approximately 50 kilometers from their base. The terrain was challenging, with hills providing potential cover for anti-aircraft weapons, and the weather forecast called for sandstorms later in the day. "This isn't going to be a milk run," the intelligence officer warned. "Enemy forces in this area have been equipped with shoulder-fired missiles and mobile air defense systems. They know we're coming, and they'll be ready." Sarah studied the target area carefully, noting escape routes, potential threats, and the most advantageous approach angles. She had memorized the recognition silhouettes of enemy vehicles and practiced engagement procedures until they were automatic responses. As the pilots prepared for takeoff, Lieutenant Colonel Thompson approached her aircraft. "Martinez, I want you to know that despite my earlier comments, I respect your determination to be here. But determination won't stop a missile. Stay sharp out there." It was the closest thing to encouragement she had received from him, and Sarah nodded her acknowledgement. She understood that his concern, however poorly expressed initially, came from a place of caring for his pilot's safety. The Apache helicopter's twin engines whined to life as Sarah completed her pre-flight checks. Every switch, gauge, and warning light received her careful attention. In combat, there would be no opportunity to return to base for mechanical problems, and a malfunctioning aircraft could mean death for both crew members. Rodriguez settled into the front seat, his hands moving efficiently over the weapons control panels. "All systems green," he reported through the intercom. "Ready when you are." Sarah lifted the Apache off the landing pad with practiced smoothness. The helicopter responded to her touch like an extension of her own body, rising into the clear morning air as she began the flight toward their target area. Behind them, 3 other Apaches followed in tactical formation, their crews ready for whatever they might encounter. As they flew toward potential combat, Sarah felt a strange calm settle over her. The nervousness and doubt that had plagued her in quieter moments evaporated, replaced by sharp focus and professional competence. This was what she had trained for, what she had sacrificed for, and what she was meant to do. The desert landscape passed beneath them, an endless expanse of sand and rock broken occasionally by small villages and irrigation canals. Sarah maintained constant communication with the other aircraft while scanning the horizon for threats, her eyes moving in the practice pattern she had learned during training. Contact bearing 270, approximately 10 kilometers, Rodriguez called out, his voice steady despite the significance of the moment. Through his targeting system, he had spotted the first elements of the enemy convoy. Sarah acknowledged the contact and began maneuvering their aircraft into an attack position. This would be her first real combat engagement, the moment that would define her career and possibly determine whether she lived or died. Every decision from this point forward would matter, and there would be no opportunity for second chances. The radio crackled with reports from the other aircraft as they spread out to attack different portions of the convoy. Sarah could see dust clouds on the horizon marking the movement of enemy vehicles, and her heart rate increased slightly as adrenaline began flowing through her system. Multiple targets confirmed, Rodriguez reported. Looks like a full armor battalion with support vehicles. This is going to be a busy morning. Sarah smiled grimly as she guided their Apache toward the battle. The skeptics and doubters would have their answer soon enough. Today would prove whether a woman could handle the demands of combat aviation, and she intended to demonstrate that gender had nothing to do with flying ability or warrior spirit. The enemy convoy grew larger in their sights as they approached, dozens of tanks and armored vehicles moving in tactical formation across the desert floor. Sarah could see muzzle flashes as enemy gunners opened fire, their tracers reaching up toward the attacking helicopters like deadly fireworks. "Here we go," she murmured to herself, her hands steady on the controls as she prepared to enter combat for the first time. Behind her calm exterior, years of training and preparation were about to be put to the ultimate test. The morning sun climbed higher in the sky, casting long shadows across the desert as history was about to be made by a young woman who refused to accept limitations based on her gender. This was her moment, and she was ready for it. The battle begins. The first missile streak past their Apache helicopter like a deadly comet, missing the aircraft by less than 20 feet. Sarah felt the heat from the exhaust plume as she threw the helicopter into a sharp, evasive turn, her training taking over as muscle memory guided her actions. "Sam, launch, 3 o'clock. Rodriguez shouted through the intercom, his voice tight with concentration as he acquired targets through the Apache's sophisticated sensor systems. Multiple launchers active in the target area. Sarah's hands moved instinctively across the controls, deploying chaff and flares while maneuvering the aircraft to present the smallest possible target profile to enemy gunners. The Apache danced through the air like a deadly ballet dancer, its movements precise and calculated despite the chaos erupting around them. Below, the enemy convoy had stopped and deployed for battle. Tank turrets swiveled toward the attacking helicopters, their main guns elevated to engage the aerial threat. Armored personnel carriers disgorged soldiers carrying shoulder-fired missiles, while mobile air defense vehicles activated their radar systems and prepared to engage. "Jesus Christ," Rodriguez breathed as he surveyed the target area through his targeting sight. Intel was wrong about the size of this force. There's got to be 60 vehicles down there, maybe more. Sarah maintained her composure despite the revelation that they were facing a much larger enemy force than anticipated. The other Apache helicopters in their formation were spreading out to avoid presenting a concentrated target, but she could see that they were outnumbered by at least 10 to 1. "Lead aircraft, this is Apache 2, she transmitted over the radio. "Recommend we call for additional support. This is a reinforced armor battalion, not a company-sized element." "Negative, Apache 2, came the response from Lieutenant Colonel Thompson's aircraft. "Higher command wants this convoy stopped before it reaches the main highway. We're all they've got in range. Weapons free, engage at will." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. They were being asked to take on an entire enemy armor battalion with just 4 helicopters. The odds were overwhelming, but orders were orders, and people were depending on them to complete the mission. "You ready for this, Martinez?" Rodriguez asked, his hands moving over the weapon's control panels as he prepared their Hellfire missiles for launch. "Born ready," Sarah replied, surprising herself with the confidence in her voice. Despite the fear gnawing at her stomach, she felt a strange sense of clarity and purpose. This was exactly what she had trained for, and she would not let her unit down. The Apache's targeting system locked onto a T-72 tank positioned at the front of the convoy. The enemy vehicle was approximately 3,000 meters away, within easy range of their precision-guided missiles. Sarah maneuvered the helicopter to provide Rodriguez with the best firing angle while watching for incoming threats. "Target acquired, tank bearing 390, Rodriguez announced. "Hellfire away." The missile streaked from its launcher with a trail of white smoke, covering the distance to target in seconds. Sarah watched through her helmet-mounted display as the Hellfire struck the tank's turret with devastating effect. The explosion was visible even from their distance, and secondary explosions indicated they had achieved a direct hit on the vehicle's ammunition storage. Good hit, she called out, already maneuvering toward their next target. Around them, the other Apache helicopters were engaging additional vehicles, their missiles creating a deadly light show across the desert landscape. But the enemy was far from defenseless. As Sarah lined up for their second shot, she saw muzzle flashes erupting from multiple positions throughout the convoy. Anti-aircraft guns opened fire with streams of tracers that looked like deadly Christmas lights reaching up toward their aircraft. "Taking fire from multiple positions," she reported, throwing the Apache into a series of evasive maneuvers that would have made her flight instructors proud. The helicopter responded instantly to her commands, diving and climbing and turning with precision that kept them ahead of the enemy gunfire. Rodriguez was already acquiring their next target when Sarah saw something that made her blood run cold. A mobile surface-to-air missile launcher had deployed and was tracking their aircraft with its radar guidance system. "Sam's sight active, bearing 270, she shouted, immediately changing course to avoid the missile's engagement envelope. But even as she maneuvered, she could see the launcher preparing to fire. The missile launch was unmistakable, a bright flash followed by a column of smoke as the weapon accelerated toward their aircraft. Sarah had perhaps 10 seconds to react before the missile would impact, and she threw the Apache into the most aggressive evasive maneuvers she had ever attempted. The helicopter rolled inverted and dove toward the desert floor while Sarah deployed every countermeasure available. Chaff bundles exploded from the aircraft's dispensers, creating clouds of metallic strips designed to confuse radar-guided missiles. Flares burst in brilliant points of light, intended to decoy heat-seeking weapons away from the aircraft's engine exhaust. For a moment that seemed to last forever, Sarah wasn't sure if their countermeasures would work. The missile continued tracking toward their aircraft, its guidance system trying to distinguish between the real target and the decoys surrounding it. Then, the weapon veered away at the last second, detonating harmlessly 200 meters to their left. The explosion was close enough to rock their aircraft with its shockwave, but they had survived their first missile engagement. "That was too damn close," Rodriguez muttered, his voice shaky despite his years of experience. "Let's take out that launcher before they get another shot." Sarah was already maneuvering toward the missile's site. Her fear transformed into cold anger. The enemy had tried to kill them, and now it was time for payback. She lined up the Apache for an attack run while Rodriguez prepared a Hellfire missile for launch. The missile launcher was repositioning for another shot when their Hellfire struck it squarely amidships. The explosion consumed the entire vehicle in a ball of orange flame, and Sarah felt a grim satisfaction as she watched the threat disappear. "Splash 1 Sam's sight," Rodriguez reported with professional calm. Moving to next target. Around them, the battle was intensifying. Apache 3 had destroyed 2 tanks and an armored personnel carrier, but was taking heavy ground fire and had been forced to withdraw temporarily. Apache 4 was engaging targets on the eastern side of the convoy, systematically working through a column of vehicles that had deployed for battle. Sarah realized that Lieutenant Colonel Thompson's aircraft had gone silent. She scanned the battlefield looking for Apache 1, and her heart sank when she spotted smoke rising from a crash site approximately 2 kilometers north of the main convoy. "Apache lead, Apache 2, come in," she transmitted, hoping desperately for a response. When none came after several attempts, she knew their flight leader was down. "Apache 3, Apache 4, this is Apache 2, she transmitted. "Apache lead appears to be down. I'm assuming tactical command of the flight." The weight of command settled on her shoulders like a physical burden. 3 helicopters against an entire enemy armor battalion, with their most experienced pilot already lost. The smart tactical decision would be to withdraw and call for additional support, but Sarah knew they couldn't afford to let this convoy reach its destination. "Apache 2, Apache 3, came a voice over the radio. "We're running low on missiles and taking heavy fire. Recommend we withdraw and rearm." Sarah looked down at their own weapon status. They had 4 Hellfire missiles remaining, plus their 30mm chain gun with approximately 800 rounds of ammunition. It wasn't much against the 40-plus enemy vehicles still active in the convoy. But as she watched, she realized the enemy was making a critical mistake. Instead of maintaining their formation and continuing toward their objective, they had stopped to fight the helicopters. This gave her an opportunity to attack them piecemeal rather than having to engage a moving convoy. "Negative, Apache 3, she transmitted. "We stay and fight? Use your guns to suppress the anti-aircraft positions while Apache 4 and I take out the heavy armor." It was a desperate plan, but it might work if they could execute it properly. Sarah began maneuvering toward a group of tanks that had positioned themselves in a depression in the desert floor, apparently thinking the low ground would provide protection from air attack. They were about to learn how wrong they were. Rodriguez had already locked onto the lead tank when Sarah noticed something that changed everything. The enemy vehicles weren't just randomly positioned. They were forming a defensive perimeter around something in the center of their formation. "Check out the center of that formation," she told Rodriguez. "What do you see?" Her weapons officer adjusted his targeting system's magnification and studied the area carefully. After a moment, he let out a low whistle. "Command vehicles," he said. "Mobile headquarters units, communication trucks, probably a senior commander's tactical operations center. That's why they stopped to fight instead of continuing their movement." Sarah felt a surge of excitement. If they could destroy the command element, the entire enemy force might be thrown into confusion. It would be a high-value target that could justify the risks they were taking. "Think we can penetrate their defensive perimeter?" she asked. Rodriguez studied the enemy formation carefully before responding. "It'll be dangerous. Those tanks will have overlapping fields of fire, and we'll have to get close to ensure accurate hits on the command vehicles." "Then, that's what we'll do," Sarah decided. "All aircraft, this is Apache 2. I've identified enemy command vehicles in the center of their defensive formation. We're going to penetrate their perimeter and take out their headquarters." "Apache 2, that's suicide," came the voice from Apache 3. "There's too much firepower down there." Sarah looked at the tactical situation displayed on her helmet-mounted system. The enemy convoy represented a significant threat to coalition ground forces advancing from the south. If these vehicles reached their intended positions, they could establish defensive lines that would cost hundreds of coalition lives to overcome. But more than tactical considerations, Sarah felt the weight of proving herself in her first combat mission. Every male pilot who had doubted her abilities, every instructor who had questioned whether women belonged in combat aviation, every person who had suggested she was too weak or too emotional for this job will be watching her performance today. "Apache 3, Apache 4, provide covering fire and suppress those anti-aircraft positions," she ordered. "Apache 2 is going in." Sarah pushed the Apache into a high-speed approach toward the enemy formation, flying so low that the helicopter's rotor wash kicked up clouds of sand behind them. Enemy gunfire erupted from multiple positions, tracers streaming past their aircraft like deadly fireworks. A 23mm anti-aircraft gun managed to score several hits on their aircraft, the rounds punching through non-critical areas of the fuselage. Sarah felt the helicopter shudder under the impacts, but maintained her course toward the target area. Taking hits, but still flying, Rodriguez reported, his voice steady despite the circumstances. Acquiring target now. Through the chaos of battle, Sarah maintained perfect control of her aircraft. Years of training had prepared her for exactly this moment, and her hands moved with practiced precision across the flight controls. She was no longer the doubted female pilot fighting for acceptance. She was a warrior in her element, focused entirely on completing the mission. The command vehicles grew larger in their sights as they closed the distance. Sarah could see enemy soldiers abandoning their positions and running for cover, realizing too late that the Apache was heading directly for their most valuable targets. Target locked, Rodriguez announced. Hellfire away. The missile struck the primary command vehicle with devastating accuracy, the explosion sending debris flying in all directions. Secondary explosions indicated they had hit something important, possibly a fuel truck or ammunition carrier position nearby. But Sarah wasn't finished. She maneuvered the Apache for another attack run while Rodriguez prepared their remaining missiles. The enemy defensive fire was becoming more intense as additional weapons systems came online, but she pressed the attack with single-minded determination. 3 more Hellfire missiles found their targets in rapid succession, each one destroying a critical element of the enemy command structure. Communication trucks, radar vehicles, and mobile headquarters units disappeared in balls of flame as Sarah and Rodriguez systematically dismantled the convoy's leadership. When their missiles were expended, Sarah began using the Apache's 30mm chain gun to engage individual vehicles and weapons positions. The gun's depleted uranium rounds could penetrate most armor at close range, and she used this capability to devastating effect. Tank after tank fell to her precise gunnery, their turrets blown off or their armor penetrated by the deadly accurate fire. Sarah flew the helicopter with an aggressiveness that surprised even herself, diving and climbing and turning to avoid return fire while maintaining devastating accuracy with her weapons. The other Apache helicopters had joined the attack, and together they began systematically destroying the entire enemy formation. What had started as a desperate mission against overwhelming odds was becoming a complete victory for the helicopter crews. Enemy vehicles began abandoning their positions and fleeing toward the east, their formation completely broken by the loss of their command structure. Sarah pursued the fleeing vehicles relentlessly, her chain gun accounting for several more tanks and armored personnel carriers. When the smoke finally cleared, the desert floor was littered with burning wreckage. The enemy convoy that had threatened coalition ground forces had been completely destroyed, their advance stopped permanently by 4 Apache helicopters and their determined crews. Mission complete, Sarah transmitted over the radio, her voice calm despite the adrenaline still coursing through her system. Enemy formation destroyed, threat neutralized. As they flew back toward base, Sarah allowed herself a moment of satisfaction. She had proven herself in combat, leading her flight to victory against overwhelming odds. The doubters and skeptics would have to find new arguments against women in combat aviation. But even as she savored the moment of triumph, Sarah knew this was just the beginning. The real test of her abilities would come in the days and weeks ahead as she continued to prove that gender had nothing to do with courage, skill, or dedication to mission accomplishment. #recognition and new challenges. The aftermath of the convoy battle brought unexpected consequences for Sarah Martinez. Word of her leadership during the engagement had spread throughout the aviation community within hours, and she found herself at the center of attention she had never sought. General Patricia Hayes, the first female 3-star general in the Army's aviation branch, arrived at their forward operating base 3 days after the mission. Sarah was summoned to the command post, where she found herself face to face with one of the most respected officers in the military. Captain Martinez, General Hayes said, her voice carrying the authority of decades of military service. I've read the after-action reports from your mission. Quite impressive for someone's first combat engagement. Sarah stood at attention, unsure how to respond. The general's reputation preceded her. She was known for her no-nonsense approach to leadership and her unwavering support for women in military aviation. Having her attention was both an honor and a source of significant pressure. "Thank you, ma'am," Sarah replied formally. "I was just doing my job, following my training." General Hayes smiled slightly, expression that didn't reach her eyes. "Captain, taking tactical command of flight during your first combat mission and leading them to victory against a reinforced enemy battalion is considerably more than just doing your job. But I appreciate your modesty." The general walked to a map mounted on the wall, studying the tactical situation in their sector of operations. Enemy forces had been conducting increasingly aggressive operations, testing coalition defenses, and looking for weaknesses they could exploit. "I have a proposition for you, Captain," General Hayes continued. "Intelligence has identified a high-value target approximately 100 kilometers northeast of here. Enemy forces have established a major supply depot and staging area in a valley system that's been difficult for our ground forces to reach." Sarah listened carefully as the general outlined the situation. The enemy depot contained fuel, ammunition, and equipment that supported operations throughout their region. Destroying it would significantly disrupt enemy capabilities, but the target was heavily defended and located in terrain that favored the defenders. Previous reconnaissance flights have identified at least 30 armored vehicles protecting the depot, plus extensive anti-aircraft defenses, General Hayes explained. "It's a tough nut to crack, and we need our best pilots for the mission." The implication was clear. Sarah was being offered the opportunity to lead another high-risk mission, this time with even greater stakes than the convoy battle. It was exactly the kind of assignment that could make or break a military career. "What's the timeline, ma'am?" Sarah asked, already beginning to formulate tactical approaches in her mind. 72 hours, the general replied. "Intelligence indicates the enemy is planning to disperse the supplies to multiple locations, so we need to hit them while everything is still concentrated." Sarah felt the familiar mixture of excitement and apprehension that preceded major combat operations. This would be a much more complex mission than the convoy engagement, requiring detailed planning and coordination with multiple aircraft and support elements. "I'll need complete intelligence briefings, current weather forecasts, and detailed terrain analysis," she said, her mind already shifting into mission planning mode. "Also, I'd like to personally select the air crews for this operation." General Hayes nodded approvingly. "Granted, you'll have access to everything we've got. But, Captain, I want you to understand something. This mission will be closely watched by people at the highest levels of command. Success will open doors for you and other women in aviation. Failure." She didn't need to finish the sentence. Sarah understood the implications perfectly. She was no longer just another pilot. She had become a symbol, a test case for women in combat aviation. The pressure was enormous, but she had faced pressure before and overcome it. "I understand, ma'am. We won't let you down." After the general departed, Sarah threw herself into mission planning with obsessive attention to detail. She studied satellite photographs of the target area, memorized the locations of known anti-aircraft positions, and analyzed weather patterns that might affect the operation. The target was located in a narrow valley surrounded by hills that provided natural defensive positions for enemy forces. The depot itself consisted of dozens of supply buildings, fuel storage tanks, and maintenance facilities spread across approximately 2 square kilometers. Chief Warrant Officer Rodriguez joined her in the planning process, his experience invaluable in developing tactical approaches that would give them the best chance of success while minimizing casualties. "This is going to be a tough one," he observed, studying the aerial photographs. "They've had weeks to prepare defenses, and that terrain gives them every advantage." Sarah nodded, but she was already developing ideas for how to neutralize those advantages. The key would be speed, surprise, and superior firepower applied at precisely the right moments. "What if we don't attack the depot directly?" she mused, tracing flight paths on the map with her finger. "What if we force them to come to us?" Rodriguez looked puzzled. "What do you mean?" Sarah pointed to a series of hills overlooking the valley. "Intelligence shows they have observation posts up there, probably with communications equipment to coordinate their defenses. What if we attack those first, blind their defensive network? They'd have to send forces to investigate and restore communications," Rodriguez realized, following her logic. "That would pull defenders away from the main depot." "Exactly. And while they're focused on the hills, we hit the depot from an unexpected direction with maximum firepower." It was a complex plan that would require precise timing and coordination between multiple aircraft, but Sarah believed it could work. She spent the next 48 hours refining every detail, creating contingency plans for various scenarios, and briefing the air crews who would participate in the operation. She had selected 6 of the best pilots available for the mission, including Captain Lisa Chun, one of the other female Apache pilots in theater. Chun was an exceptional pilot with outstanding gunnery skills, and Sarah knew she could count on her to execute the plan flawlessly. "Nervous?" Chun asked as they completed their final equipment checks the night before the mission. "Terrified," Sarah admitted honestly. "But that's probably good. Fear keeps you sharp, keeps you focused on the details that matter." Chun smiled. "My flight instructor in training used to say that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's doing your job despite being afraid." Sarah found comfort in the reminder. She had been afraid during the convoy battle too, but she had pushed through that fear and accomplished the mission. Tomorrow would require the same kind of mental toughness, but on a larger scale. The mission briefing the next morning drew attendees from throughout the base. Word had spread that something significant was planned, and the room was packed with pilots, ground crews, and support personnel who wanted to hear the details. Sarah stood before the assembled group, feeling the weight of their expectations and the significance of the moment. She had gone from being a doubted outsider to leading major combat operations in a matter of weeks, and the responsibility was both exhilarating and terrifying. "Good morning," she began, her voice clear and confident despite her inner turmoil. "Today's mission is designed to destroy a major enemy supply depot that has been supporting hostile operations throughout our sector." She outlined the plan methodically, explaining each phase of the operation and the role each aircraft would play. The complexity of the mission was evident, but Sarah's detailed preparation and clear briefing gave everyone confidence in their ability to execute successfully. "Questions?" she asked after completing the briefing. An older pilot raised his hand. "Captain, what's our contingency if the initial phase doesn't work as planned?" Sarah had anticipated this question and had prepared multiple alternative approaches. "We have 3 backup plans depending on how the enemy responds," she replied, outlining each option in detail. Another pilot asked about weather concerns, and Sarah provided a detailed meteorological briefing that covered wind conditions, visibility forecasts, and potential weather hazards. After answering all questions, Sarah dismissed the briefing and headed to her aircraft for final preparations. The mission would begin in 2 hours, and there were still dozens of small details that required her attention. Chief Rodriguez was already conducting his pre-flight inspection when she arrived at their helicopter. The Apache looked magnificent in the early morning light, its weapons pylons loaded with Hellfire missiles, and its chain gun loaded with armor-piercing ammunition. "Ready to make history again?" Rodriguez asked with a grin. "Let's focus on coming home alive," Sarah replied, though she appreciated his attempt to lighten the mood. History can take care of itself. As she completed her own pre-flight checks, Sarah thought about the path that had brought her to this moment. Every challenge, every insult, every moment of doubt had been preparation for missions like this one. She was no longer proving she belonged. She was leading others into combat and accepting responsibility for their lives and mission success. The other aircraft in the formation completed their preparations and reported ready for takeoff. Sarah looked around at the faces of her fellow pilots, seeing determination and professional competence that had nothing to do with gender or background. They were warriors, all of them, united by their commitment to mission accomplishment and each other's safety. Tower, Apache flight. Request clearance for takeoff. She transmitted over the radio. Apache flight cleared for takeoff. Good luck out there. Sarah lifted her Apache into the air, leading 5 other helicopters toward what would become one of the most significant air-to-ground engagements of the conflict. Behind them, the sun climbed higher into a cloudless sky, casting long shadows across the desert landscape. The flight to the target area would take 45 minutes, giving her time to review the plan one final time and prepare mentally for the challenges ahead. But as the base disappeared behind them and the hostile terrain grew larger ahead, Sarah felt the same calm focus that had served her well during the convoy battle. This was what she had trained for, what she lived for, and what she was meant to do. The doubters and skeptics had been proven wrong during her first combat mission. Today, she would prove that the first victory hadn't been luck or accident, but the result of skill, determination, and the warrior spirit that transcended gender. The target valley appeared on the horizon as a dark line between 2 ridges, seemingly peaceful in the morning sunlight. But Sarah knew that within minutes, that peaceful appearance would be shattered by the thunder of rotor blades and the explosions of precision-guided munitions. She keyed her radio to address the other aircraft in her formation. All aircraft, this is Apache lead. Target area in sight. Prepare for combat operations. The acknowledgments came back crisp and professional. Her pilots were ready, their aircraft were functioning perfectly, and the mission parameters were well within their capabilities. Everything that could be controlled had been controlled. Now it was time to execute the plan and prove once again that excellence in aviation had nothing to do with the pilot's gender. As they approached the target area, enemy forces below remained unaware of the approaching threat. Soon, they would learn that underestimating Captain Sarah Martinez and her flight had been a fatal mistake. Hashtag the depot assault. The enemy supply depot spread across the valley floor like a small industrial complex, with dozens of buildings, storage tanks, and vehicle parks connected by a network of dirt roads. Sarah studied the target through her helmet-mounted display system, noting the positions of anti-aircraft guns and the movement patterns of enemy personnel. Multiple SAM sites active, Rodriguez reported from the front seat, his voice tense with concentration. I count at least 6 mobile launchers plus numerous gun positions. Sarah acknowledged the information while maneuvering their Apache into position for the first phase of their attack plan. The other helicopters in her formation had split into 2 groups, one preparing to attack the observation posts on the surrounding hills, the other waiting for her signal to begin the main assault. Apache 2, Apache 3, commence Phase 1, she transmitted over the radio. Hit those observation posts hard and fast. Captain Chen's voice came back immediately. Roger, Apache lead. Phase 1 commencing now. Sarah watched as Hellfire missiles streaked toward the hilltop positions, each one precisely targeted to destroy the enemy's eyes and ears overlooking the depot. The explosions bloomed orange and black against the rocky hillsides, and she could see secondary detonations as communication equipment and ammunition stores were destroyed. The reaction from the depot was immediate and predictable. Alarm sirens wailed across the valley as enemy forces scrambled to respond to the unexpected attack. Vehicle engines roared to life as armored personnel carriers and tanks prepared to move toward the hills to investigate and restore communications. Perfect, Sarah murmured to herself, watching the enemy forces react exactly as she had hoped. They're taking the bait. She waited until approximately half the depot's mobile defenses had begun moving toward the hills before giving the signal for Phase 2. This was the critical moment when timing and coordination would determine the success or failure of the entire mission. All aircraft, commence Phase 2. Hit them now while they're dispersed. Sarah rolled her Apache into a steep dive toward the depot, leading the assault from the front as Hellfire missiles and 30mm cannon fire erupted from all 6 helicopters simultaneously. The morning air filled with the thunder of rotor blades and the sharp crack of exploding ordnance. Her first target was a large fuel storage facility near the center of the depot. The Hellfire missile struck the primary tank with devastating effect, creating a massive fireball that consumed several nearby buildings and vehicles. The explosion was so intense that Sarah had to adjust her flight path to avoid flying through the rising column of flame and smoke. "Good hit on the fuel farm," Rodriguez called out, already acquiring their next target. Moving to the ammunition storage area. Around them, the other Apache helicopters were systematically destroying critical infrastructure throughout the depot. Storage buildings disappeared in clouds of debris. Vehicle parks erupted in chains of secondary explosions, and maintenance facilities collapsed under the impact of precision-guided munitions. But the enemy wasn't helpless. Anti-aircraft guns throughout the depot opened fire with streams of tracers, creating a deadly light show that forced all the helicopters into violent evasive maneuvers. Sarah threw her Apache into a series of rolls and dives that would have been impossible in any other aircraft, the helicopter responding to her commands with the precision of a finely tuned machine. A mobile SAM launcher that had remained hidden near the depot's eastern edge suddenly activated its radar and prepared to engage. Sarah saw the threat indicator light up on her defensive system's display just as the launcher fired its missile. "Missile launch, bearing 090, she called out over the radio, simultaneously deploying countermeasures and throwing the Apache into the most aggressive evasive maneuvers in her repertoire. The surface-to-air missile tracked toward their aircraft with deadly persistence, its guidance system trying to distinguish between the real target and the clouds of chaff and flares Sarah had deployed. For several terrifying seconds, she wasn't sure their countermeasures would work. Then, the missile veered away at the last moment, exploding harmlessly 200 meters to their right. But before Sarah could feel relief, Rodriguez was already calling out a new threat. "Multiple gun positions tracking us from the south," he reported. "Recommend we suppress those positions before they get a clear shot." Sarah maneuvered their Apache toward the anti-aircraft guns, her chain gun already spinning up for engagement. The 30mm depleted uranium rounds could penetrate most armor at close range, and she intended to use that capability to silence the enemy defenses permanently. Her first burst of cannon fire struck a 23mm anti-aircraft gun position, the high-explosive rounds detonating among the crew and destroying the weapon's electrical systems. The gun fell silent immediately, its crew either killed or forced to abandon their position. But even as she engaged one threat, new ones appeared throughout the depot. It seemed like every building and vehicle park had been equipped with weapons capable of engaging her helicopters, and the enemy gunners were becoming more accurate as they adjusted to the attacking aircraft's flight patterns. Apache 4 taking hits came an urgent transmission over the radio. "Engine fire warning. Attempting emergency landing." Sarah's heart sank as she watched one of her helicopters limping toward a clear area outside the depot perimeter, smoke streaming from its damaged engine. The crew was alive, but they were now stranded in hostile territory and would need immediate rescue. "Apache 5, Apache 6, provide cover for Apache 4, she ordered. "Apache 2, Apache 3, continue the attack on primary targets." The mission was becoming more complex by the minute, but Sarah maintained her focus on the overall objective. They had come here to destroy the enemy supply depot, and despite the complications, they were succeeding. Fires burned throughout the target area, and secondary explosions continued to rock the valley as ammunition and fuel supplies detonated. Rodriguez had locked onto what appeared to be the depot's command center, a cluster of buildings and communication antennas near the northern edge of the complex. "Command post identified," he reported. "Request permission to engage." "Granted," Sarah replied, maneuvering the Apache to give him the best firing angle. "Make it count." The Hellfire missile struck the command center with pinpoint accuracy, the explosion destroying not only the buildings, but also a nearby communications truck and what appeared to be a mobile radar unit. The loss of their command structure would make it much more difficult for enemy forces to coordinate their defense. As the battle continued, Sarah began to notice something remarkable happening. The enemy's defensive fire was becoming less coordinated and less accurate. The combination of destroyed observation posts, the loss of their command center, and the chaos created by the ongoing attack was breaking down their ability to fight effectively. Apache lead, this is Apache 3. Captain Chen's voice came over the radio. I count at least 15 vehicles destroyed in the eastern sector. Enemy forces appear to be withdrawing toward the northern exit. Sarah looked toward the northern end of the valley and could see dust clouds marking the retreat of enemy vehicles. But she wasn't ready to let them escape with whatever supplies they could carry. All aircraft pursue and destroy withdrawing enemy forces, she ordered. Don't let them escape with intelligence or critical supplies. The chase that followed would become legendary in aviation circles. 6 Apache helicopters pursuing a fleeing convoy through narrow mountain passes, their chain guns and remaining missiles accounting for vehicle after vehicle as the enemy attempted to escape with whatever they could salvage from the destroyed depot. Sarah led the pursuit personally, her Apache dancing through the rocky terrain with breathtaking skill as she tracked individual vehicles and destroyed them with surgical precision. Her marksmanship with the 30mm cannon was extraordinary, each burst of fire finding its target despite the challenging terrain and high-speed maneuvering. Tank after tank fell to her guns, their crews abandoning their vehicles and fleeing on foot rather than face the relentless accuracy of her weapons. Armored personnel carriers and supply trucks suffered the same fate until the mountain passes were littered with burning wreckage. Ammunition truck, Rodriguez called out, identifying a high-value target among the fleeing vehicles. Sarah maneuvered for a clear shot while avoiding the rocky walls of the narrow pass. Her cannon fire struck the truck's cargo area with devastating effect, the explosion so powerful that it echoed off the canyon walls like thunder. When the pursuit finally ended, the enemy convoy had been completely destroyed. Not a single vehicle had escaped to carry word of the attack or salvage critical supplies for future operations. The depot assault had achieved complete success, destroying not only the static targets, but also the mobile forces that had attempted to defend them. Mission complete, Sarah transmitted over the radio. All primary and secondary objectives destroyed. Beginning return to base. As they flew back toward their forward operating base, Sarah allowed herself a moment to appreciate the magnitude of what they had accomplished. A major enemy supply depot that had supported hostile operations throughout their region had been completely destroyed. The loss of fuel, ammunition, and equipment would significantly degrade enemy capabilities for weeks to come. But more than a tactical success, Sarah felt a deep satisfaction in having led her fellow pilots through a complex and dangerous mission without losing a single crew member. Apache 4 had been recovered successfully, its crew rescued by ground forces, while the other helicopters provided cover. "Hell of a job out there, Martinez," Rodriguez said over the intercom. "I've never seen flying like that, and I've been doing this for 15 years. The compliment meant more to Sarah than Rodriguez probably realized. Recognition from a seasoned veteran like him was worth more than any medal or official commendation. It meant she had truly earned her place among the elite pilots of military aviation. As their forward operating base appeared on the horizon, Sarah began thinking about the after-action reports she would need to write and the debriefings that would follow. But she also thought about the larger implications of the day's success. 2 major combat missions, 2 complete victories, and leadership performance that had exceeded everyone's expectations. She was no longer the female pilot fighting to prove herself. She had become one of the most respected combat aviators in theater, sought after for the most challenging and important missions. The radio crackled with congratulations from the base as they approached for landing. Word of their success had already spread, and Sarah could see ground crews and other pilots gathering to welcome them home. But even as she prepared for landing, Sarah's mind was already turning to future challenges. The war was far from over, and there would be other missions, other opportunities to prove that excellence in aviation transcended gender, background, or any other artificial barriers. She had wanted to be judged by her performance rather than her gender, and that goal had been achieved beyond her wildest dreams. The doubters and skeptics had been silenced by results that spoke louder than any argument or protest. As the Apache touched down on the landing pad, Sarah felt a profound sense of accomplishment and vindication. She had proven herself in the most demanding environment possible, and in doing so, had opened doors for other women who shared her dream of military aviation. The battle for acceptance was over. The war, however, was just beginning, and Captain Sarah Martinez was ready for whatever challenges lay ahead. She had found her calling, and nothing would ever be the same. #Legacy of a Warrior. 6 months after the depot assault, Captain Sarah Martinez stood in the Pentagon briefing room, facing a collection of senior military officials, defense contractors, and policymakers who had gathered to hear her testimony about women in combat aviation. The setting was far removed from the dusty desert bases and smoking battlefields where she had earned her reputation, but the pressure was just as intense. "Captain Martinez," began Senator Elizabeth Watkins, the chairwoman of the Senate Armed Services Committee, "your combat record speaks for itself. 47 confirmed vehicle kills, 2 major strategic victories, and 0 losses among the air crews under your command. But I want to understand the broader implications of your success." Sarah had grown comfortable with public speaking over the past months, though she still preferred the cockpit of an Apache helicopter to any conference room. Her military bearing remained impeccable despite the attention and accolades that had followed her combat achievements. "Ma'am, I believe my experience demonstrates that combat effectiveness is determined by training, skill, and determination rather than gender," she replied. "The enemy doesn't check your birth certificate before they shoot at you, and missiles don't discriminate based on who's flying the aircraft." The response drew murmurs of approval from some attendees and skeptical looks from others. Despite her proven record, there were still those who viewed her success as an anomaly rather than evidence of broader capabilities among women in military aviation. General Hayes, who had become something of a mentor to Sarah, leaned forward at the witness table. "If I may add to Captain Martinez's comments, her performance has been consistently exceptional across multiple mission types. She's not an outlier. She's an example of what's possible when we focus on capability rather than preconceptions." The hearing continued for over 2 hours, with Sarah fielding questions about everything from physical requirements for aviation duty to the psychological pressures of combat leadership. She answered each query with the same professional competence that had characterized her military service, providing factual responses based on her experiences rather than ideological arguments. But Sarah's thoughts kept returning to the events that had brought her to this moment. The convoy battle that had first proven her combat abilities seemed like a lifetime ago, though it had been less than 8 months since that morning when she had led her flight against overwhelming odds. The real test hadn't been that first engagement or even the depot assault that followed. The true measure of her impact had come in the weeks and months afterward as other female pilots began arriving in theater and looking to her for guidance and leadership. Lieutenant Jennifer Walsh had been one of the first, a young pilot fresh from training who arrived at their forward operating base with obvious nervousness about her upcoming combat assignments. Sarah remembered their first conversation vividly. "Captain Martinez, ma'am," Walsh had said, standing stiffly at attention in Sarah's makeshift office. "I've read about your missions, and I just wanted to say that you're an inspiration to all of us." Sarah had gestured for the lieutenant to sit down, recognizing the mixture of admiration and anxiety in the younger woman's expression. "Lieutenant, forget about inspiration and focus on preparation. Study your aircraft systems, know your weapons capabilities, and trust your training. Everything else is just noise." It had been the beginning of an informal mentoring relationship that Sarah had maintained with dozens of female aviators over the following months. She had realized that her success carried responsibilities beyond personal achievement. She had become a role model, whether she wanted the title or not. The transformation hadn't been limited to female pilots. Male aviators who had initially been skeptical of women in combat roles gradually came to accept Sarah's leadership based on her demonstrated competence. Lieutenant Colonel Thompson, who had made disparaging comments before her first mission, had become one of her strongest supporters. Martinez, "I owe you an apology," he had told her after the depot assault mission. "I let my preconceptions cloud my judgment about your capabilities. You're one of the finest combat pilots I've ever served with, regardless of gender." The acknowledgement had meant more to Sarah than any official commendation. Changing minds through performance rather than argument had always been her preferred approach, and Thompson's conversion demonstrated that even the most entrenched skeptics could be won over by results. As her reputation grew, Sarah found herself assigned to increasingly challenging missions. Each success built on the previous one, creating a record of achievement that became impossible to dismiss or attribute to luck. By the time her deployment ended, she had become the most decorated female combat pilot in military history. But the statistics only told part of the story. The real impact of her service could be seen in the changing attitudes throughout the aviation community and the increasing number of women pursuing combat aviation careers. Chief Warrant Officer Rodriguez, who had served as her weapons officer throughout their deployment, captured the transformation perfectly during their final mission debrief. "You know what I'm going to miss most about flying with you?" he had asked as they completed their post-flight inspections for the last time. "What's that?" Sarah had replied, genuinely curious about his perspective. "Flying with the best pilot in the unit," Rodriguez had said simply. "Not the best female pilot, not the best pilot despite being a woman. Just the best pilot, period." The comment had summarized everything Sarah had worked to achieve. She had wanted to be judged by her performance rather than her gender, and Rodriguez's words confirmed that goal had been accomplished. Now, sitting in the Pentagon briefing room, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her from a small town in Texas to the forefront of military aviation policy. The path had been difficult, marked by challenges and obstacles that her male counterparts had never faced, but the destination had been worth every struggle. "Captain Martinez," Senator Watkins continued, "what would you say to young women who might be considering military aviation careers but are intimidated by the physical and psychological demands?" Sarah considered her response carefully. She had become adept at balancing honesty about the challenges with encouragement for those who shared her passion for flying. "Ma'am, I would tell them that aviation is demanding regardless of your background, but it's also incredibly rewarding for those who are willing to put in the work. The key is focusing on your capabilities rather than your limitations, and never accepting anyone else's definition of what you can or cannot achieve." The hearing concluded with commitments from military leadership to expand opportunities for women in combat aviation and to continue evaluating performance-based standards rather than gender-based restrictions. It was a victory not just for Sarah personally, but for all the women who would follow in her footsteps. After the formal proceedings ended, Sarah found herself in General Hayes' office, discussing the future of her military career. The general had been advocating for Sarah's promotion and assignment to increasingly responsible positions, but Sarah had her own ideas about how to best serve her country. "I've been thinking about requesting assignment as an instructor pilot," Sarah said. "There's a whole generation of aviators coming up who could benefit from the lessons we've learned in combat." General Hayes smiled approvingly. "I was hoping you'd say that. We need experienced combat pilots in training roles, and your perspective would be invaluable for both male and female students." The assignment to the Army Aviation Center of Excellence came through within weeks, along with her promotion to major. Sarah found herself back in the familiar environment of flight training, but this time as an instructor rather than a student. Her first class included 12 student pilots, 4 of whom were women. The mix represented the changing demographics of military aviation and the growing acceptance of women in combat roles. But Sarah was careful to treat all her students equally, focusing on their individual strengths and weaknesses rather than their gender. Flying an Apache helicopter in combat requires split-second decision-making, precise motor skills, and the ability to function under extreme stress, she told her students during their first class. These requirements don't change based on your background or gender. What matters is your dedication to mastering the skills necessary to succeed. One of her female students, Second Lieutenant Maria Santos, approached Sarah after the first week of training. Santos was struggling with some of the more complex weapons systems procedures and was clearly frustrated by her difficulties. "Major Martinez, I'm worried I'm not cut out for this," Santos confided. "Some of the other students seem to pick things up faster than I do." Sarah recognized the self-doubt in the younger woman's voice. She had experienced similar moments during her own training, and she knew how important it was to provide both honest assessment and constructive encouragement. "Lieutenant, everyone learns at a different pace, and struggling with complex systems doesn't mean you lack the aptitude to succeed," Sarah explained. "The question is whether you're willing to put in the extra work necessary to master the material. Natural talent is helpful, but dedication and persistence are more important in the long run." Santos took the advice to heart, spending additional hours in the simulator and studying technical manuals until the procedures became second nature. By the end of the course, she was performing at the top of her class and had earned recognition as the outstanding graduate. "Thank you for not letting me quit," Santos told Sarah during the graduation ceremony. "You showed me that the only real limitations are the ones we place on ourselves." It was exactly the kind of moment that made Sarah's transition to instruction meaningful. She was no longer just proving her own capabilities. She was helping develop the next generation of combat aviators and ensuring that the door she had opened would remain open for others. The impact of her combat record continued to resonate throughout the aviation community. Studies of her missions became case studies in military academies, and her tactical innovations were incorporated into official doctrine. The convoy engagement, in particular, was analyzed as a textbook example of adaptive leadership under pressure. But perhaps the most significant measure of her legacy was the steady increase in women pursuing combat aviation careers. The number of female Apache pilots doubled within 2 years of her deployment, and similar increases were seen across all combat aviation platforms. Sarah maintained contact with many of the women she had mentored, following their careers as they progressed through their own deployments and leadership assignments. Each success added to the foundation she had helped establish, proving that her achievements were not anomalous, but representative of capabilities that had always existed, but had been previously underutilized. Years later, when Sarah looked back on her military career, she would remember not just the excitement of combat flying, but the satisfaction of helping change an entire culture. The young woman who had faced skepticism and discrimination during her early training had become a catalyst for transformation that extended far beyond her individual achievements. The skeptics who had doubted whether women belonged in combat aviation had been proven wrong not by arguments or political pressure, but by demonstrated performance under the most demanding conditions possible. Sarah's 47 confirmed vehicle kills were impressive statistics, but her true victory had been changing minds and opening opportunities for generations of aviators who followed. Standing at the podium during her retirement ceremony many years later, Colonel Sarah Martinez looked out at an audience that included dozens of women who had built successful careers in military aviation. Some had become squadron commanders, others had transitioned to civilian careers as airline pilots or aerospace engineers, and a few had followed her path into instruction and mentorship roles. "When I first arrived at flight school," she said during her retirement speech, "I just wanted the chance to prove I could fly as well as anyone else. I never imagined that pursuing my own dreams would help create opportunities for so many others." The applause that followed was heartfelt and sustained, a recognition not just of her individual achievements, but of the broader transformation she had helped bring about. The military aviation community had been permanently changed by her service, and that change would continue to benefit future generations of pilots regardless of their gender. As Sarah walked away from the podium for the last time as an active duty officer, she felt a profound sense of accomplishment. She had achieved everything she had set out to do, and more, proving that excellence in aviation truly did transcend artificial barriers and limitations. The young girl who had built model airplanes in a small Texas town had become a combat veteran, an inspirational leader, and a catalyst for positive change. Her legacy would live on in the careers of the pilots she had mentored, the tactical innovations she had pioneered, and the cultural transformation she had helped bring about. The battle for acceptance was over, won not through politics or pressure, but through demonstrated competence under fire. Women in military aviation had earned their place through performance, and that place would never again be seriously questioned. Sarah's story had begun with a simple desire to fly, but it had become something much larger, proof that when given equal opportunities, women could achieve excellence in any field, even those traditionally dominated by men. The 47 tanks she had destroyed in combat were impressive statistics, but her greatest victory had been proving that courage, skill, and dedication had nothing to do with gender. The sky, once limited by artificial barriers, was now truly the limit for anyone with the determination to reach for it.